The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. Until the sound broke through. A slap. Sharp. Echoing. Every head turned. Gasps filled the air. And there, at the center of it all, stood Vanessa Monroe. She didn't flinch. Didn't stumble. Didn't say a word. But her eyes? Cold. Focused. Like glass over fire. Judge Reynolds had frozen mid-motion, gavel hovering in the air. The bailiff stood stunned. Even the defense team, 5 suited men with overpriced haircuts, looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under them. Across the room, Harriet Langston, heiress to the Langston real estate empire, still had her palm raised. Trembling. She had it coming, Harriet hissed. You don't talk to me like that. You're nothing. Just a court-appointed attorney. Vanessa's silence was louder than a scream. No one moved. Not until a young intern in the back whispered, "Who is she?" And that's when things began to shift. Because the answer wasn't what anyone expected. 2 hours earlier, Vanessa had walked into the courthouse without fanfare. No entourage. No camera crews. No designer bag. Just a simple navy suit, a worn leather briefcase, and eyes that had seen too much for someone who still looked barely 40. She sat alone at the defense table. A small case. Real estate fraud. Petty squabble between tenants and one of Langston Group's subsidiaries. No one paid her any mind. But they should have. Because Vanessa had been preparing this day for years. And the Langstons? They had just walked into her storm. Harriet Langston strolled in 10 minutes late. Blonde bun. Blood-red lipstick. Gucci heels. Flanked by 2 of her family's top lawyers, David Colborne and Jenna Strauss. She didn't even look at Vanessa as she sat across from her. "Is that the lawyer?" she whispered, not softly. "I thought she'd be older. Smarter looking." Jenna chuckled. "Don't worry. We've buried tougher." Vanessa said nothing. She simply flipped through a folder. Page by page. Calm. Controlled. But the tension? It was already bleeding into the room. The hearing started with standard motions. Boring to most. Strategic to Vanessa? Harriet interrupted constantly. Objected to everything. Rolled her eyes so often it became a nervous tic. Judge Reynolds gave warning after warning. Until Vanessa spoke. Just one line. "Your Honor, I request that Ms. Langston refrain from threatening opposing counsel while the court is in session." The room froze. Harriet's smirk vanished. "What did you just say to me?" she snapped. Vanessa turned her gaze to her. Calmly. Directly. "I said you're out of line?" That's when it happened. Harriet stood. Crossed the floor. And slapped her. Right there. In open court. The courtroom exploded. Judge Reynolds shouted for order. The bailiff stepped forward. Lawyers scrambled to shield Harriet. Reporters began texting furiously. Phones buzzed. Cameras clicked. And Vanessa? She slowly reached into her briefcase. Pulled out a thin envelope. Stamped with a federal seal. "You'll want to read this, Your Honor," she said quietly. Her voice, the first calm in the storm. Judge Reynolds took it. Eyed her suspiciously. Then opened it. The color drained from his face. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Because something had just shifted. And no one, especially not the Langstons, was ready. Harriet Langston sat down slowly, as if realizing too late she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses. Still pale. Still silent. The envelope from Vanessa lay open in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Langston, what you just did. She provoked me," Harriet barked. "You all saw it. She disrespected me. I saw you assault opposing counsel in a federal courtroom." The judge snapped, finally finding his spine. "You are on very thin ice." Vanessa didn't look at Harriet. Didn't look at anyone. She just sat. Calm. Quiet. Waiting. Because the real move hadn't even started yet. Outside the courtroom, news had already started to trickle through the building. Someone from the clerk's office had seen the envelope. Someone else had recognized the seal. Word was spreading, quiet at first. Then faster. By the time the second recess was called, a crowd had begun to form in the hallway. Journalists, law students, other attorneys, even a few judges lingering too long near the elevator just to pass by. Vanessa ignored them all. She sat on a bench near the window, sipping from a cheap plastic water bottle, staring out toward the skyline like it was just another Thursday. But inside? The Langston legal team was spiraling. "I thought you said she was nobody," Jenna whispered harshly to David. "She was," David hissed back. "No history. No firm. Nothing flagged." Harriet paced in heels that suddenly felt too loud for the room. "She's bluffing. She has to be." But no one was sure anymore. David glanced toward the judge's chambers, where Reynolds had locked himself in with the envelope. "She handed him something with a federal seal," he said. "That's not a bluff, Harriet. That's a statement." Harriet spun around, finger pointed. "You fix this. That's why I pay you. You bury her. Today." Jenna hesitated. "You don't bury someone who hands a federal judge sealed documents, and doesn't even flinch when you slap her." Harriet didn't answer. Because deep down, she already knew. Something was wrong. And Vanessa Monroe wasn't the woman she thought she could humiliate. Back in the courtroom, the third session began. Judge Reynolds looked different now. Less smug. Less performative. He leaned forward. Eyes sharper than before. "I've reviewed the documents submitted by Ms. Monroe. They check out. And they change everything." Harriet sat straighter. "What documents? What the hell are you talking about?" Vanessa finally spoke again. "In accordance with federal oversight procedures, and due to ongoing investigations into the Langston Group's real estate acquisitions, I've been appointed as a special independent counsel by the Department of Justice." The air got sucked out of the room. "I'm sorry, what?" Harriet blinked. Vanessa slid a copy of her appointment across the table. Harriet didn't take it. Jenna did. Her hands trembled. "This can't be right," she muttered. This isn't real." "Oh, it's real," Vanessa said quietly. "And everything you've done, every forged inspection, every coerced eviction, every shady shell corporation, it's all going to be reviewed. Starting today." David tried to stand. "This is illegal." "She can't." "She can," Judge Reynolds cut in. "And she will." Harriet jumped to her feet again. "I want her removed. This is a conflict of interest." Vanessa looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "There's no conflict," she said. "Because I'm not here for you." Harriet's voice cracked. "Then who the hell are you here for?" Vanessa stood slowly. And smiled. "Your victims." That's when the courtroom changed. It wasn't just about money anymore. Not just about contracts, and zoning laws and faceless tenants. It was about justice. Real justice. And suddenly, the woman Harriet thought she could slap into silence had all the power. And Harriet? She had just made the worst mistake of her life. The Langstons weren't used to losing. They were used to buying time. Buying influence. Buying silence. But not this. Not a courtroom turning against them. Not a woman with no name recognition, no firm pedigree, no flashy public image, tearing down their wall of lawyers, clause by clause. So they did what rich people do when they feel cornered. They fought dirty. An hour into the hearing, David Colborne filed an emergency motion to disqualify Vanessa from the case. On the grounds, he declared confidently, that Ms. Monroe failed to disclose her prior involvement in a civil suit against Langston Holdings. A clear and present conflict. The courtroom murmured. Harriet crossed her arms smugly, lips curled like a cat watching a cornered mouse. Vanessa didn't react. But for the first time that morning, the judge hesitated. "Is this true, Ms. Monroe?" he asked. Vanessa stood. Yes, she said plainly. I filed a case 8 years ago as legal counsel for a disabled veteran who lost his home due to Langston Group's fraudulent property sale. And the result of that case? The judge asked. Vanessa's eyes were steady. We lost. On a technicality. Harriet grinned. So much for justice. David pressed, sensing blood. And now you're here again, with a federal title, going after the same entity you've already sued. Your Honor, this is personal. Vanessa didn't flinch. But the room could feel it. The tide was turning. Judge Reynolds sighed. I'll need to review this new information. We'll recess for 30 minutes. No contact between parties. We reconvene at 3 o'clock. In the hallway, the mood was electric. Reporters swarmed both sides. Vanessa, do you have a comment on the disqualification request? Ms. Monroe, is this revenge? What's your connection to the DOJ? She said nothing. Just walked slowly, calmly, into a small private room. Inside, her hands finally shook. Not out of fear, but fury. They were trying to twist justice into a weapon. Again. Meanwhile, Harriet and her lawyers were already celebrating. This is good, Jenna said. Even if she's not thrown off the case, she'll be neutered. The judge will have to narrow her authority. I told you, Harriet said, sipping from her cold-pressed juice. Everyone has a weakness. David added. We delay. We overwhelm. We smear her reputation until she folds. They laughed. Loudly. Because that's what empires do when they think they're untouchable. At 3 o'clock, the courtroom filled again. Judge Reynolds re-entered. No expression on his face. Vanessa was already seated. Her posture perfect. Her expression unreadable. After reviewing the motion, the judge began. And consulting with the Office of Legal Counsel, I've reached a decision. You could hear a pin drop. The prior case brought by Ms. Monroe does not constitute a disqualifying conflict. In fact, it was properly disclosed in her federal application process and found irrelevant to her appointment. He looked directly at Harriet. Which means she stays. Gasps. Audible. Loud. Harriet's face flushed red, then white. But, the judge continued, I will be limiting today's scope to the current fraud claims, and not the broader DOJ investigation. He didn't get to finish. Because that's when it happened. A man in a dark suit stepped into the courtroom. He wore no tie. No badge. No announcement. He simply handed the judge a folder. And whispered something in his ear. Judge Reynolds went pale. Again. Then stood. This hearing is suspended immediately. All parties are to remain in the building. The Department of Justice has requested an emergency injunction, effective now. Harriet jumped to her feet. What? This is harassment. Vanessa finally spoke again. No, Ms. Langston, she said softly. This is what it feels like when they finally knock on your door. The courtroom turned into chaos. Phones rang. Reporters ran out the doors. Harriet screamed at her lawyers. Vanessa stood in the middle of it all, still, like the eye of a storm. She didn't smile. Didn't gloat. She simply watched as everything began to collapse, just as she knew it would. The Langston Empire had spent years taking homes, silencing voices, corrupting the system. And now, with one slap and one sealed envelope, they had triggered their own downfall. The hallway outside Courtroom 7B looked like a crime scene. Agents in dark suits were everywhere. Clipboards. Radios. Earpieces. And for the first time in her adult life, Harriet Langston didn't know where to look. She clutched her handbag like a lifeline. David whispered rapid legalese into his phone. Jenna kept repeating, "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. Because the man who walked in with the sealed folder wasn't just any federal official. He was from Public Integrity, the DOJ's watchdog division. And he'd come for her. Inside the holding room, Vanessa Monroe sat quietly across from the lead agent. "Thank you for the envelope," he said. It was the last piece we needed. Vanessa nodded. She had waited 5 years for this moment. Is the judge cooperating? She asked. The agent smirked. More than you'd think. Turns out he's been sitting on complaints about Langston Group for months. Pressure from above kept him quiet. Vanessa looked toward the window. Not anymore. Back in the courthouse, chaos tightened its grip. Harriet was now separated from her team, escorted to a different waiting area. For her protection. She was used to controlling rooms, dinners, fundraisers, city council meetings. But this room? She couldn't control anything. Her phone buzzed. Dad. She answered quickly. Fix this, came the voice on the other end. No cameras. No charges. Use the governor if you have to. Harriet's voice cracked. They're saying she's federal counsel. That she has documents. That you're on the list. Handle it, Harriet. Or don't come home. The line went dead. She dropped the phone. By 4:15 p.m., the Langston legal team had been locked out of their own servers. Subpoenas had been issued. The DOJ's cyber division was inside Langston HQ. And Vanessa? She walked calmly into a side conference room where 3 reporters waited. She didn't give a full statement. Didn't smear anyone. Didn't gloat. She simply handed them a packet, sealed and time-stamped. Everything you need is in here, she said. Depositions, falsified inspections, whistleblower statements. Just tell it right. The oldest of the reporters, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a reputation for bringing down corrupt city officials, took the packet gently. You're the one who's been sending those encrypted tips, she whispered. Vanessa said nothing, but her eyes confirmed everything. At 4:23 p.m., Judge Reynolds returned to the bench. Everyone was back in their seats, or what was left of them. Harriet sat alone now. Her team had vanished. Her phone was gone. Her voice, smaller than anyone had ever heard. Judge Reynolds addressed the room with unusual clarity. As of this moment, the court is in receipt of federal findings implicating multiple executives of the Langston Group in conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Emergency asset freezes are underway. He looked directly at Harriet. You, Ms. Langston, are no longer a witness. You are now a named subject in an active investigation. Harriet's mouth opened. Then closed. No sound came out. Then, finally, Vanessa stood. She took her time. Walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. And spoke for everyone to hear. 5 years ago, a veteran named John Ellis was evicted from his home because the Langston Group falsified documents and backdated a foreclosure. He died 2 months later in a shelter, waiting for an appeal. She paused. Langston attorneys buried the case. Harriet Langston signed the paperwork herself. Gasps filled the room. Vanessa continued. Steady. Firm. I swore I'd never let that go unanswered. Harriet finally stood. Desperate. You think you're a hero? You think this changes anything? My family owns this city. Vanessa turned to face her. No, she said. Not anymore. The bailiff stepped forward. Gently took Harriet's arm. She resisted at first. Then stopped. There was nowhere left to run. The cameras clicked. The reporters whispered. And Vanessa Monroe stood alone, but taller than anyone in the room. She didn't need applause. Didn't want revenge. Just justice. And now it was here. 1 week later, the Langston building stood quiet. No lights in the upper floors. No suits pouring in from black town cars. No receptionists greeting investors with fake smiles. The empire had collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a signature. Frozen accounts. Confiscated records. 10 executives under federal indictment. And Harriet Langston? Out on bail. Awaiting trial. Forbidden to leave the state. The headlines had done their job. Real estate royalty falls in federal sting. The woman who shut them down, inside Vanessa Monroe's silent war. Justice for the invisible, one attorney's 5-year fight for truth. But Vanessa? She didn't give interviews. She didn't sign book deals. She just kept working. In a small office on the east side of town, no view, no logo, just a worn door with a peeling nameplate, Vanessa Monroe sat with her sleeves rolled up and a pen in her hand. A young woman sat across from her. Nervous. Clutching paperwork. Tears in her eyes. "My landlord raised the rent 3 times in 6 months," she said. "Said if I didn't like it I could leave. But I have a kid. I didn't know what to do." Vanessa looked through the papers. Quiet. Focused. Then nodded. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. The girl looked up. "Can you help?" Vanessa smiled, gently this time. "We're going to help a lot more than just you." Meanwhile, down at City Hall, an emergency motion passed unanimously. A housing reform bill, one that had sat dead on the agenda for years, was finally pushed forward. Eviction protections. Rental cap enforcements. A new board to investigate fraudulent development deals. And it all bore a quiet signature at the bottom. Drafted with oversight from Special Counsel Vanessa Monroe. As for Judge Reynolds, he held a private press conference days after the Langston case broke. Admitted fault. Acknowledged fear. But also praised Vanessa. "She reminded me what the bench is supposed to stand for," he said. And she did it without ever raising her voice. The media loved it. But Vanessa? She didn't even watch. 3 months later, Harriet Langston walked into a courtroom again, but this time, wearing a gray suit that wasn't designer and holding a plea deal and shaking hands. 30 months in federal prison. Loss of corporate control. Restitution to dozens of victims. She tried to bargain. But there was no more empire to hide behind. Just consequences. Vanessa sat in the back that day. No announcements. No camera crew. Just a quiet seat in the gallery. When the gavel fell, she stood up. Turned. And walked out. Not because she didn't care. But because justice had been served. And she had work to do. Outside the courthouse, a reporter spotted her. "Ms. Monroe." Just one question. Vanessa paused. The reporter held up a microphone. "Why do this? Why go after people like the Langstons when you could have taken safer cases, easier clients?" Vanessa thought for a moment. Then answered with 3 words. Words the internet would later turn into quotes, posters, memes, and t-shirts. Words that would live longer than the Langston Empire ever did. Because no one else would. Then she walked away. Into the noise. Into the fight. Into the next battle. And the city. Finally. Had someone worth believing in.